unbelievable. Michael Saylor is now publicly talking about the destruction of the Brics nations, and Bitcoin is the key player in this currency war between the West, specifically the US, and the Brics nations. Michael Saylor is urging the US to buy 25% of the Bitcoin supply to maintain its position as a leading economic and global power and to significantly strengthen the US dollar. In 2021, this could mean the end for the Brics nations, because Michael Saylor is also urging the US to sell off its gold and use that to buy Bitcoin. That would mean that the entire gold reserves of the Brics nations would become almost worthless at the same time. At the same time, the US dollar and Bitcoin will be massively strengthened. Bitcoin is going to explode massively, and the US dollar will regain its former strength. And then it could be that all the capital worldwide from the Brics nations and much more flows into the US. The US would then be the big winner, and Bitcoin has made this possible. At the same time, Bitcoin will be trading at several $million, and anyone who already has Bitcoin will probably no longer have to worry about money. The USA is then the big winner, and Bitcoin has made this possible. At the same time, Bitcoin will be trading at several million US dollars, and anyone who already has Bitcoin will probably no longer have to worry about money. This is a scenario that has been anticipated for a long time, and many people have already speculated about it, about a speculative attack and much more. And now, indeed, Michael Saylor is very openly saying that this could potentially be the USA's mega coup and that this strategy could, in fact, actually be implemented now. To what extent it is happening, whether it is really the 25% that the USA is buying up from Bitcoin supply, because that is, of course, an incredibly high number. I don't think it's even possible for the US to buy 25% here, but let's say 10%, let's say 15%. This would cause their Bitcoin to go massively to the moon, and the US dollar would probably become by far the strongest and most solid currency. It would probably also mean the end of what you might call a crazy soft currency standard, and instead we'd have a fiat standard that's really backed by hard assets. Let's take a look at the latest statements from Michael Saylor on this, because they really pack a punch. What we're seeing here right now is really a currency war. We're seeing the Brics nations wanting to be independent from the US dollar. At the same time, we see the US realizing that the US dollar is weakening, and they're starting to panic. And now we need to come up with strategies on how to further strengthen the US dollar. We've seen that the Saudis have let the petrodollar deal expire. We've seen that Russia and Putin have understood Bitcoin and that they're betting on it. We've seen that China is now loosening up for Bitcoin again. We're seeing that external payment infrastructures are being set up by the Brics nations to become independent from the US dollar. For decades, even centuries, people have been enslaved by the US dollar. Now they want to break free, and the US is striking back, with Michael Saylor possibly being the frontman in this currency war. Michael Saylor could be the keystone here that will also enable the US to further strengthen the US dollar. Because the MicroStrategy playbook that Michael Saylor has already laid out could now be applied in a similar way at the Bitcoin reserve strategy level for the US. Just like Cynthia Loomis has called for, we should sell gold and buy Bitcoin with it. Michael Saylor is now also advocating for selling gold to buy Bitcoin. Just like Cynthia Loomis has called for, we should sell gold to buy Bitcoin. Michael Saylor is now also calling for selling gold to buy Bitcoin. But Cynthia Loomis only said that to basically build a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Michael Saylor goes even further. Michael Saylor aims to push nations to collapse. Hear from Saylor: buy 20 to 25% of Bitcoin for the US and let others sell assets for Bitcoin, directing money to the U.S. But listen to what Michael Saylor himself has to say here.
So the basic idea is to buy 20 or 25% of the Bitcoin network. Initiate the World Reserve Capital Network. For a bold move, sell US gold, buy Bitcoin. The trade is free. Get 5 million Bitcoin for gold. Demonetize gold. Enemies' assets fall, ours rise. Get rid of your gold and buy Bitcoin instead. You could snag 5 million Bitcoin for the price of the gold. We would control the world reserve capital and currency. You'd devalue the gold assets, and since our enemies hold gold, their assets would drop while ours would rise, and we would control the world reserve capital. So what's happening right now is just incredible. Android Trojan dollars, and we would control the world reserve capital, or now work as well as the world reserve currency nowhere.
So what's happening right now is just unbelievable. Who would have thought that Bitcoin, which has been around for over 15 years and was once laughed at, is now really at a level where it's about the national security of the US? And Bitcoin is a crucial factor here. Michael Saylor makes it very clear: buy 20 to 25% of the Bitcoin network, and that would kickstart or act as a catalyst to make the US the strongest currency. And Bitcoin is a crucial factor here. Michael Saylor makes it very clear: buy 20 to 25% of the Bitcoin network, and that would kickstart or act as a catalyst to make the US the strongest currency. And what happens when the US has the strongest currency? All the capital thousands that's currently being pulled out of the US because the currency keeps getting weaker, is flowing back into the US because it has the most attractive bonds, the most appealing currency, and so on. Dollar expansion with stablecoins like Tether is inevitable. More dollarization will occur if the dollar stays strong. Confidence will boost, drawing global capital. But that only happens if the dollar can stay strong. So that means if we have Bitcoin-backed US dollars, or at least have Bitcoin as a reserve in the background, it will bring so much confidence in the US dollar that, let's say, Russian capital, Chinese capital, European capital, Japanese capital, it will all flow into the US dollar. And now here comes the kicker. You take the gold reserves, and the US still has a ton of gold reserves. You never really know exactly how much gold reserves the US has. There are various estimates about Fort Knox. No one can really see how much gold is actually there and so on. Some say the US is leading the pack, while others argue, no, other nations like China have already surpassed the US because through shadows, let's say, like proxy banks and so on, they've built up gold over several years. Without KYC, without verification, all anonymously. You can't really know for sure. It's all pretty opaque. But now we're also seeing that all the BRICS nations are ramping up their gold purchases, and many believe that, for example, the BRICS nations want to create some sort of gold currency. I know you can't really see what's going on behind the scenes. Some say A, some say B, some say they do this, some say they don't do that. If you ask gold bugs, they're all building some kind of gold currency. The US betting on Bitcoin. If you ask anyone from the Bitcoin camp, they tend to be a bit skeptical, saying they're not so sure if they're really building a gold currency. It could definitely be the case that if we have the US betting on Bitcoin and the BRICS nations betting on gold, then that would really be the mega deal. It's so wild, it's almost hard to imagine. The US not only backs the dollar with Bitcoin, but also sells off all its gold reserves. And what happens when the gold gets dumped on the market? Then the gold reserves lose value, but that's very bad because the US would take losses, and they'd have all these gold reserves that are becoming devalued. So the first gold reserves they sell, they'll still get something for them, but the more they flood the market and the faster they do it, the less they'll get for the last of the gold reserves they still have in Fort Knox. They would capitulate. So the first gold reserves they sell, they'll still get something for them, but the more they flood the market and the faster they do it, the less they'll get for the last of the gold reserves they still have in Fort Knox. That means 2001, they would essentially be surrendering here. By initiating this gold capitulation, we would crash the gold price and harm BRICS nations, causing two major effects. First, Bitcoin demand and price will skyrocket as gold is sold to buy Bitcoin. As Bitcoin's price rises, more people will join the trend. The first effect is that at the same time, the demand for Bitcoin and its price will skyrocket because with the gold that's being sold, they're now buying Bitcoin. So the demand for Bitcoin goes up, the price goes up, and when others notice the price rising, even more people jump on the Bitcoin bandwagon. This creates an ultimate FOMO effect. You really have to do it quickly enough, which means you shouldn't spread it out over 5 or 6 years, but rather do it all at once. Just bam, sell all the gold. Of course, it can't happen all at once because you have to find enough buyers first, but it's really not about getting the highest prices for the gold sale. It's purely about hurting the BRICS nations and pushing Bitcoin. And if you can accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible as quickly as you can, then the price of Bitcoin will go up. You'll already have a lot of Bitcoin in your possession, and at the same time, all that gold is going to wear, maybe the currency of the new BRICS nations is being built. And if you can accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible as quickly as you can, then the price of Bitcoin will go up. You already have a lot of Bitcoin in your possession, and at the same time, all that gold is basically going to wear, maybe the currency of the new BRICS nations is being built. Gold would basically be worthless. All that gold would just be trash. Before selling gold, remember to use a 6-month phase to print money. Push the dollar to the brink by printing and buying bitcoins. Acquire 2 million bitcoins by overinflating the dollar. Capital flows back into the dollar. BRICS and others start buying US Treasury bonds again. If the dollar is in demand, everyone jumps in. The plan devalues the US dollar by printing money to buy Bitcoin, initially weakening it. As Bitcoin backs the dollar, trust returns, attracting global capital and boosting its value. Phase 2 involves selling gold to crash its price, creating chaos. Maybe you could reach 1 or 2 million bitcoins if you print lots of money, inflating the dollar, and buy lots of Bitcoin. Sure, the dollar would lose trust at first, but the more Bitcoin you buy, the more trust returns because people see a ton of money is being printed, which causes inflation, and then the dollar is supported by Bitcoin. Then capital from countries, nations, and superpower starts returning to the US dollar. You get this dual effect. On one hand, you can counter inflation, and on the other hand, there's increased dollar demand in global trade. The BRICS, China, Japan, Russia, Europe, and so on, they start buying treasury bonds, not the governments, but investors. They go where the best opportunities are. And if everyone wants the US dollar because it's popular, then everyone's investing in the US dollar. First phase, you print money, buy Bitcoin, boost Bitcoin, and weaken dollar. Next phase, the dollar gets strengthened because it attracts capital from around the world. Now, you take all your gold and sell it, causing chaos and crashing gold. This would mean anyone owning gold would be a big loser. It would mean all the nations investing in gold, the BRICS, but also Europe and so on, would be in trouble. I shouldn't say it like that, but they'd be in a bad spot. You have to be honest, it's not just the BRICS that would have a problem. Europe would also face an issue. All the nations that have haven't backed their currency with Bitcoin would be in a mess. And this is also the important point, I'd say. There are nations anticipating this because so that was phase one. You print money, buy Bitcoin with it, pump the Bitcoin price, and weaken the dollar in the first phase. In the second phase, the dollar gets strengthened again because it pulls in all the capital from around the world. Now comes the second phase, and this is the sneaky phase. You take all your gold and sell it off as quickly as possible, creating a total chaos scenario and massively crashing the gold price. That would obviously mean that anyone holding gold is a massive loser. It would mean that all the nations betting on gold, the Brics nations, but also Europe and so on, would be in big trouble, like really in trouble. I shouldn't say it like that, but they'd be in a really bad spot. You have to be honest, it's not just the Brics that would have a huge problem. Europe would also face a big issue. All the nations that haven't backed their currency with Bitcoin would be in a huge mess. And this is also the big thing. I'd say there are other nations that see this coming because if, for example, if Russia sees this coming, or if China or Japan sees this coming, then they really need to start buying Bitcoin massively because they could also launch this kind of attack. That means the US could pull off this attack, but the Brics currencies could also do it. China could launch such an attack, Russia could do it, even Europe could pull off something like this. I mean, if Europe were really smart and had the guts, they could do what Michael Saylor is pitching, and then Europe would be the world power. If Russia sees this coming, or if China or Japan sees this coming, then they really need to start buying up Bitcoin massively because they could also launch this kind of attack. That means the US could pull off this attack, but the Brics currencies could do it too. China could launch such an attack, Russia could do it, even Europe could pull off something like this. I mean, if Europe were really smart and had the guts, they could do what Michael Saylor is pitching, and then Europe would be the world power. You can hardly imagine it because they're way too dumb, but theoretically, it would be possible. I have to honestly say, the plan is really, really out there. 25% of the supply is an incredible amount. 25%, I mean, that's more than 5 million Bitcoin. That would really be the regions that Robert Kennedy Jr. suggested here. I mean, you have to be clear about one thing. Every time you buy Bitcoin here, you are pumping the Bitcoin price even higher, and you are essentially creating slippage, which means you get worse and worse entry prices. So the first million Bitcoins are relatively easy to accumulate. The second million might still be doable, but the third million is almost impossible. The fourth million is super tough, and the fifth million, that's just incredibly hard. You'd have to throw in so much money, and by the time the US buys 5 million Bitcoins, the price of Bitcoin will be way over a million, way over a million. Then we really get into the regions that Michael Saylor talks about, 13 million, and in a bull case, 45 million and stuff like that. I think Michael Saylor's bull case was that if nation-states start buying up Bitcoin massively, and we see strategic Bitcoin reserves everywhere, then we could really hit that 45 million he talks about. So it's an incredible scenario that Michael Saylor is laying out here. If you still want to buy Bitcoin and be part of this whole, let's say, crazy mayhem scenario, then I absolutely recommend checking out 21 Bitcoin. I'll drop a link for you below, the easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe, and with the code BitcoinHotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Hit me up with a subscription here on YouTube. It's important that we get going with this channel. It's time to take off for Bitcoin to really win, for Bitcoin to be recognized, and for people to wake up and realize what's going on here. Because what's happening here is really crazy. See you, take care, peace out, 1000.